Hi everyone, welcome to the video on sampling. All of you in 8084 should watch this, and I will talk specifically about survey sampling, interview sampling, and observational sampling as it comes up that there are differences. As you watch the video, I recommend that you start writing the paragraph that you need to write to describe your sampling procedure. So start drafting and thinking about how are you going to write up your decision around who you're going to interview and or who you're going to observe, etc. So the first thing you need to ask in doing a sample, a survey sample, is who is your population? So what is the broad boundary of the group of people you're interested in? So for example, let's look at this research question. What is the role of accountability and poverty in elementary science teaching practice in the Bay Area? So broadly, I'm interested in elementary science teachers in the Bay Area. That's my population. So then the question is, well, why don't I survey or interview or observe all of them? And I think you know the answer to that, right? There's no way for me to even to survey all of them, all of the elementary teachers who teach science in the Bay Area. So I need to somehow sample them in such a way that I can still say something about this population of people. And the way that I decide to sample them has to do with the purpose of my research. So what are the main parameters of my research question? What are the important aspects? And the main parameters of my research question are the role of accountability and poverty. So aside from defining the entire population as being elementary school science teachers in the Bay Area, I know that the role of accountability and poverty are important. And so that will help direct my sampling. So I know I'm interested in elementary teachers in the Bay Area, and I know I want to think about accountability and poverty when I do my sampling. Now, I'm going to talk about 5 different ways to sample. Most of these different ways to sample are drawn from this book by Rhea and Parker, which is on survey methods. And this book is the reference for this book is in our syllabus. So if you'd like to cite any of this, you can cite Rhea and Parker 2005, and the full reference is there. So we have 2 major categories of sampling: non-probability and probability. Probability is for doing survey research and quantitative research. Essentially, you're trying to randomize your sampling so that you can generalize to a larger population. Non-probability means you're not as worried about saying that your interview of 3 teachers should generalize to all teachers. Even if I was to interview 3 teachers in the Bay Area, elementary teachers, about their science education, I might get some very important understandings about what's going on for them, but I probably would not say that it generalizes to the entire population of elementary science teachers in the Bay Area, right? So there's other reasons why we might use a non-probability sampling that I will talk about as I go through these slides. So a convenient sample is simply you talk to the people who are convenient, or you observe the people who are convenient. So this might be, if you're doing teacher observations, it might be the teachers that you know, or it might be the ones you supervise. If you are interviewing principals, it might be 1 or 2 principals who are your friends, or who you know through your work somehow. Definitely easy to access people this way. The weaknesses is that you don't really have a plan. You're just interviewing or surveying the people that you have access to. Now, that said, for your pilot study, many of you will have a convenience sample because, as I talked about before, you don't want to burn out the people that you want to do for interview or observe for your dissertation. All right. Now, observations, a lot of times people are willing to be observed many times. Interviews and surveys, less so. All right. So it is perfectly fine to do a convenient sample for your pilot study, but I would like you to write it up just like you would write up any sampling procedure, that you are doing a convenience sample, and why you're doing a convenience sample, and all that kind of thing. So if I was to do a convenience sample of my research question, I know several elementary teachers in the Bay Area. I might ask them to let me interview them regarding their science practices, or I might ask them to let me observe their classroom regarding their science practices. In terms of the weaknesses, though, you can see here, there's no way for me to determine very much about the accountability context in advance, because what if all of the teachers I know are at a very high income context? Now, for the pilot study, many of you may also do snowball sampling, because this is where you ask one person to talk to you, for example, if you're interviewing, and then that person recommends the next person to talk to you, etc. So you go in somewhere, you get one person to talk to you, and you get recommendations for others. This is also known as a key respondents or network sampling. So you've got another citation here. And allows you to survey or to interview people or to observe people who are most knowledgeable or who have key experiences. So, for example, maybe you are trying to understand the experiences of very committed members of GANAS, which is a support group for students on our campus. And you know one student who regularly goes to meetings, and so you ask that student to introduce you to other students who also regularly attend the meetings. You're getting probably quite a good sample by doing the snowball sampling. But once again, this doesn't generalize. So you'll be, kind of getting this network of people who know each other, but maybe they all have one kind of experience. And what about the people who have a different kind of experience? You won't get a chance to talk to them. So there are strengths and weaknesses. Finally, under non-probability sampling, we have theoretical or purposive sampling. This is what I recommend for qualitative research for your dissertation. So those of you doing observations or interviewing, you certainly can try to do this for your pilot study as well. If it's possible, I highly recommend it. But if you're just trying to get a few people to talk to or to observe, then you don't necessarily need to. So a theoretical or purposive is to decide who to interview or survey based on your theory. This allows you to identify and survey or interview or observe people who have key theoretical traits. So in the theory of that underlies my research question is that accountability pressure will drive instructional practice in science education. So if I'm going to try to interview people, I'm going to use this theory to select different kinds of people. In my case, I'm going to perhaps interview a series of teachers from a high accountability pressure situation where they're under the gun for math and language arts scores, and interview a series of teachers from a low accountability pressure situation where their scores are already very high. So that would be allowing theory to guide my selection of people. And that's something that you should consider, many of you should consider. So if you're interested in the experiences of African Americans in special ed settings, perhaps you want to differentiate by the kind of psychologist that they were assessed by, because that psychologist might have made a difference in what happened. For others of you who are using or thinking about critical race theory, you may want to differentiate, for example, by race. So that's the kind of thing you would think about as you consider your sampling. Now we're moving into sampling structures that are more often used for surveys or for quantitative data. In many cases, when you collect quantitative data or surveys, you want random selection. So you want to select the people to take the survey out of the group of folks randomly so that you can say that this is probably a representative sample of all of them. So, for example, in terms of the question, what is the role of accountability and poverty in an elementary science teaching practice in the Bay Area? If I wanted to do random sampling, I would make a list of all of the teachers who teach elementary science in the Bay Area, assign numbers to them, and then use a random number generator to randomly select however many teachers I wanted to survey, maybe 200. This controls for unobserved differences across groups. So that way, just in case, I was if in the theoretical purpose of sampling procedure, if I went to a school that was high accountability pressure and a school that was low accountability pressure, and I surveyed all the teachers, there could be unobserved traits, like maybe the leadership of one of the school was exemplary. And so what I would find out would not be generalizable to all teachers across the Bay Area because there was something going on in one of those schools that was not controlled for. The difficulties with this is that it's difficult to carry out, and there are forms of biases that are unaccounted for. For example, it doesn't take into account the way groups work. So for example, teachers probably have very particular experiences in particular districts. So I might want to move into a slightly different form of sampling to find out, in order to take into account the way districts or schools mediate what happens with teachers in accountability settings. So you can see that random selection might be problematic, right? I don't have a list of all the elementary teachers in the Bay Area, for example. So even if I could, and even if I did have a list of all of the thousands of elementary teachers and assign them random numbers, it'd be a little bit difficult to reach out to all of them and manage all of that data. And also, I would have some trouble controlling for school level factors. So that's why we have cluster sampling. So in order to answer that question or to address that problem of random sampling, we have what's called cluster sampling. In cluster sampling, you do it by levels. So districts and schools are perfectly situated to select by levels because they're kind of clustered within one another. So the first level is districts. Let's say there's 25 districts in the Bay Area. I might select 20% of the districts, and I would have a reason for doing so. Why 20%, for example? Let's say 20% of the districts, so I would select 5 districts randomly. I would assign each district a number, use a random number generator, and select 5. And then out of those 5 districts, for each district, I would list the schools. So District 1 has 10 schools. I would list them. And let's say this time I'm interested in selecting 50% of the schools from each district. So I would randomly assign numbers, and I would select 5 schools from District 1 and say District 2 has 20 schools. I would assign numbers and I would select 10. And then finally, for teachers, let's say for each school, I list all the teachers, and then I randomly select the teachers within that school. Maybe I'm only interested in 20% of the teachers in. So you can see that this might help in narrowing down how to get a hold of the number of teachers that you might want, or then you can just contact the school or the principal and give them to the teachers, right, etc. Weaknesses, sometimes you end up with the wrong people, right? Maybe again, if I'm randomly selecting, am I going to get districts that are in program improvement and districts that are not? We don't know because I haven't directed the sampling at all. It's completely random. So that can be a weakness. Also, in terms of the percent of each and so forth, you have to be very careful. Like if I want 50% of the districts in the Bay Area, like I end up with 15 districts, I may only have one teacher per school. And so you really think about that. Do you want a heavier sampling at each school and therefore select less schools? Do you want more teachers at each school and therefore select fewer schools or fewer districts, right? So you have to think about those kinds of things. So to correct for the issues of cluster sampling that I just brought up, you may want to do stratified sampling. In this case, you might want to separate key elements of the population to make sure each area that you're interested in is adequately represented, and then randomly select from within them. So in the case of my study of teachers, elementary teachers, I may divide up the schools, for example, once I'm at the school level, into schools that are in program improvement and schools that are not in program improvement. So schools that have accountability pressure and schools that don't. And then make sure to select a certain number of schools from each. So in that way, I'm ensuring that I'm getting enough of a sample of what I'm interested in theoretically. And that you can also do it when your data is not clustered, like in cluster sampling. So for example, if you have, let's see, just you're interested in the students of one school, but you are interested in an issue that has a racial component. So you would separate them into groups based on ethnicity and be sure to select, let's say you want to select 10 students from each group based on ethnicity. In interviews, same sort of thing. You often are doing a stratified, or sometimes this is really actually akin to a theoretical sample. So let's say you're interested in differences between Latino and Black male students in experiencing discipline. You would perhaps sample 3 students, 3 Latino students, and 3 Black students. So those are a few ways of doing sampling. So in thinking about all those different kinds of sampling, even if you're sampling for interviews or observations, you may want to think about it in terms of clusters or in terms of stratification. So those last two. So for example, if you, for your dissertation, wanted to understand the way elementary teachers thought about science at a particular school, you have all these grade levels. What are you supposed to do? So you've got, I like to sometimes draw it out, right? I've got my school and I've got first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Do I want one teacher from each grade? Is that what's going to answer my question? Do I want all of the teachers? Do I want to select all of the teachers from fourth and fifth grade because they teach more science, for example? Whereas if I get one from each grade, I'm going to understand something of what's going on in each grade. When I get all fourth and fifth, I'm going to understand a lot about what's going on in fourth and fifth, right? Maybe I select a few teachers from second and third grade because they have a little bit less pressure to teach science, and then a few teachers from fourth and fifth because they have a lot of pressure to teach science. So if I'm interested in the way pressure affects science teaching, I might look at it like that. If I'm interested in accountability, I actually might select a few teachers from first grade because they are not held accountable for test scores, and then a few teachers from the upper grades. Right? So depending on what you're interested in is how you select your sample. Just remember that you can get depth or you can get breadth. It's really hard to get both. So you can deeply understand what's going on in fifth grade by interviewing everyone in fifth grade, or you can broadly understand what's going on across the school, but not understand that well each particular grade. Now, I want to talk to you for a moment about reducing error. The first thing to think about is, have you really gotten a sample? And the first things I'm going to talk about have to do with surveys only. So with surveys, is it representative of the population that you're wanting to represent? So if you've done the proper sampling to really get at the group of people you're trying to measure. The next is considering patterns of people who choose not to take it. And it's one reason to do a cluster sampling or to do a very careful sampling is that you want, once you send it out, you actually want 70% or so of the people you send it to take it. So you do a very careful sampling so that you have contact with those people and can really get them to take it. And then there's this idea of what is a large enough sample. Of course, this is different from the pilot study than the dissertation. The dissertation, it depends a lot on the size of the population. With huge populations, so if you have, if you're surveying all freshman students at Cal State East Bay, maybe 300-ish is good. And 100 is generally adequate for survey data. With small populations, like if you are interested in what the teachers at a particular school think about something, just survey everyone, all right? But what you really want, if you have a very large population, you don't really need more than 50% of that population, okay? You also really want to try to get, and I mentioned this above, 70% of those you target for the survey to answer the survey. Now, for your pilot study, 15-ish, maybe 20 surveys is a fine amount for you to get enough data to test your survey out and to do some data analysis. So these numbers do not apply to your pilot study. They apply to your dissertation. Now, some of you in your dissertation, you may just be, for example, I think one of you wants to just survey all of the Black teachers in a particular district, and there's only 33 of them. That's perfectly fine. You're essentially getting a population sample from your district. You wouldn't have to have 100, so don't panic. All right, now moving into qualitative data. Interviews, like the number that you would need for a dissertation, it depends on the diversity of perspectives you need, and it also depends on if you're collecting other data. My general rule for my dissertation folks is if they're only doing an interview study, if interviews are the only kind of data they're collecting, is I recommend 12 to 15 interviews for an EDD dissertation. Observations, when you're doing interviews and observations, you kind of balance that out, and that's something that you usually would work out with your chair. Now, just a reminder for the pilot study, if you're doing an interview study, you only need 3 interviews. So you really only need 3 data. So when you start your data collection for your dissertation, you may need some incentives for getting people to take a survey, or to do an interview. Sometimes you can give a gift card, like an Amazon gift card. I've done that before. You may enter them into a drawing. Sometimes that can help. You can reduce the time or length of a survey or interview. Definitely really long surveys are hard to get people to do. You can give the survey in a captured environment. It always still needs to be voluntary, but you can give it, for example, in a class, like you can ask a teacher to give the survey to the students, or you can ask, maybe it's after a work meeting, like a faculty meeting, and you ask folks to do it during the faculty meeting. It really helps to create a relationship. So if you want all of the faculty at a particular school to take your survey, or you want to interview a couple of people, go to the staff meeting of that school and present, talk to them about it. Or if you want to do an interview, ask someone personally for that interview. Go track them down during a meeting or an event and say, hey, look, I'd really love to chat with you about this. It makes a huge difference. So I'm going to close with going over a couple of examples from the literature about how people write up their sampling design. And this is where you can really get your pen out, scribbling out your own paragraph regarding your sample. So this is from Ritchie. You see the citation up above. And she says, to help to prepare current and future educators to teach for social justice, so you can see the purpose, I want to start with teachers already enacting critical teaching and learning from them. So now she's saying, here's the theoretical basis of the sampling I want to use. I use the following selection criteria. The description of the teacher's work has been published in book or journal articles, and the teacher has been identified as successfully enacting critical pedagogy or is currently practicing is a currently practicing educator. So these are the initial selection criteria. Kind of difficult, actually. This is very strict sampling. And then she made further refinement based on age, years teaching, etc., in order to ensure a wide variation. So first she narrows it to a very highly bounded group, but then within that group, she wants a wide variation of ethnic diversity, age, etc. Interesting, right? Then using a combination of purposeful and snowball sampling strategies, those should sound familiar to you now. She identified participants, and she uses a couple of projects to do that. And then she finally says a total of 8 teachers participated. So then she gives her final sample. And in fact, ultimately, of course, next quarter, when you actually are writing up your results of your little pilot study, you will talk a little bit about who those folks are that you sample for your Now, this is an example of a survey sampling procedure. This is from my dissertation. And you can see here that I selected one district in which I was going to survey the teachers. I noted how many teachers there were in the school district. This is a pseudonym. And then I calculated the minimum sample size needed using a calculation that's available in RIA and Parker. You certainly don't need to do that for your pilot study. Then using clustered sampling, teachers within schools within districts, this should be familiar to you. This requires sampling half the elementary schools or a total of 22 schools. So within the district, I sampled 22 schools. But I used a stratified sampling procedure to select the schools. I created 4 bins based on the API scores, the test scores of the school, to provide pools to randomly select schools because I really wanted to understand the accountability context, which was the research question I've been talking about this whole time. That was the research question from my dissertation. I wanted to understand the way elementary science teachers responded to certain accountability contexts. And so in order to make sure to get a representative sample from each kind of context, I divided the schools up into 4 accountability bins, and then I selected from each. All right. And then I make a note, well, the survey will not be generalizable in terms of all population, but they might be analytically generalizable to contribute to theory building.